Well, I am a psychologist. I studied philosophy and psychology, and then moved more into the area of brain science in medical psychology. And so my PhD actually started with the topic I'm some sort of trying to pursue on time perception, to understand how the brain generates our experiences of time. And I started with my PhD with looking at how injuries to the brain affect subjective time. And from then on, it's like the thread in my career that I'm really looking at different aspects of time perception. Had some studies on fMRI, so brain activation during subjective time when people had to do time perception tasks. So I would say I'm even doing some philosophy of time, but mainly psychology and neuroscience of time. And I'm now at the Institute of Frontier Areas of Psychology in Freiburg, where I'm pursuing my interests. Maybe as a student, it came from my interest on death. So the existential dimension of time, that is how it some sort of began. But then, as usual, or as it happens in life, I encountered or was able to see that there was Ernst Pöppel, a professor in Munich, who did time perception research, and I became aware that I could do my internship at the Institute of Medical Psychology in Munich. And that's what I did. So when I saw, I could do this internship on this topic of time, I really just rushed to get this internship. And that's how I started working on time perception. Then I was first an intern there, and then I became a student assistant. Then I stayed there, did my PhD and a little postdoctoral research. And that's how I just fell into it, some sort of not only accidentally, but really voluntarily. And since then, I'm pursuing my interest on studying time perception. So you could say that was my interest as a student. I'm studying psychology and philosophy. That death is something like the existential dimension of humans, and it means we are in time and our lifetime has an end. And we are sort of directed towards, there's a temporal dimension directed towards death. And that's, of course, Martin Heidegger's idea, so he evolved that quite a lot. And I sort of delved into these questions. And of course, that is an experience. So the end of time, our personal existence, is a perception of time, and also the direction of time that we experience is also an interesting thing, because that is actually also a problem in physics. How do we define, how does it come that we have a direction of time? And also in psychology, that we are some sort of prospectively, proactively always directed towards the future. Of course, we have also memories. We can direct ourselves towards the past, or memories come up and we are some sort of aware of our past. But basically, even if we say we are in the present moment, we're always some sort of directed towards the future. And so from this existential dimension, it was an easy step also to look at general aspects of subjective time. Subjective time is of essence to understand consciousness and self-consciousness, because we are aware of experience, or we have experienced extended time, over time. There is no experience without time. So time is, speaking of that in that way, of essence. And you could say, well, experience is always also self-experience. So if we have an awareness, it's always some sort of self-awareness is always part of the whole thing. So self-consciousness and consciousness, you could even say, are in essence also one. And then time comes into play, because we if we experience ourselves over time, we also experience, we experience ourselves across time. And that's even breaking it down to everyday experience. We perceive time because we experience ourselves. Think about a waiting situation. We're waiting, we experience ourselves predominantly, we are bored. And so suddenly self is up-regulated, the sense of self and the sense of time. So time and self are intricately related. Or take the other experience, we're totally immersed in some interesting activity, a conversation, a movie, and then suddenly we don't experience ourselves because we're so immersed in what we're doing, and we're not only failing to sense ourselves, but also failing to sense time. So, for example, if you're watching a thrilling movie, time passes very quickly. So sense of self and sense of time are always both up-regulated and down-regulated. And that's why it's also, from a psychological point of view, so important that self-consciousness and time consciousness are some sort of researched in one package at the same time. So I'm the PI of the Freiburg project part, and what we're doing is looking at the relationship of subjective time and self-regulation, self-experience in healthy individuals. So we're doing some sort of the groundwork to look at these relations with healthy individuals, participants in our experimental studies, and this knowledge then will be used in the research in psychiatry in the Strasbourg and the Cologne group, where they will take up our experiences to test patients and to also not only diagnose patients, but also to say train and treat patients to some sort of change the experience of, for example, slow time, slow passage of time that a lot of these patients suffer from. And so this is a direct, so we have then the other groups from Helsinki and Würzburg which we work together because they give us means to, with software, with measurement techniques, which allow us to test these subjects and to test the physiological and EEG parameters of the individuals here, in our case in Freiburg, healthy subjects, but then also with patients in Strasbourg and Cologne. We're doing the groundwork in really testing or diagnosing how is time related to other emotional and self-related processes, and then also to see if we change some parameters, how does time change and how does self-consciousness, emotion change. So these two pieces of evidence we're looking for: diagnosis and then also training, changing subjective time. So what we're using is as technology is virtual reality, and which is really something really fascinating because it gets into ideas of, for example, the movie Matrix, where you get so much immersed into a world, a virtual world, that you some sort of forget where you actually are, that you're actually just in a room and in a different world where you're sort of embodied and situated. So you some sort of get immersed into this virtual world, and we then can also manipulate this world. And so through this manipulation of the world, then also you change your sense of time. And that's what we're trying to do, to on the spectrum between hardly anything is happening in such a virtual world related to boredom and empty time, to some sort of thrilling encounters with very dynamic environments where we then feel just a fast passage of time. We try to diagnose and sometimes change subjective time. I would say at the moment, so for our working group, for the Freiburg group, the challenges are all purely scientific. So the usual challenges in that we have to find what are the perfect measures, the good measures for subjective time, because we can ask different questions. There is not the one experience of time, but we can have the experience of duration related to clock time. We can have a subjective impression of passage of time, as fast or slow. Or we can ask how much did you pay attention to time? That's a third question. There can also be other questions, and were you more related to your future self, or did you have memories, your past self, or were you more present focused? So you already see how many different questions you could ask, and also how you relate this to different facets or other variables related to the self, which could be subjective or are more physiological. You could relate to the bodily self, the heart rate, the breathing rate, how we are aware of this, but also physiological, how the heart rate, for example, changes, to EEG, to how the brain waves change. So we all have to relate all this together. So I would say in the Freiburg group, this is a thrilling challenge, is to identify the right parameters and also find the right, you could say, find the right correlations between time and other parameters. I think the more interesting it will become, or more challenging will be then later to transfer the knowledge to the patients group with depression or with schizophrenia, to see whether then these correlations we have found in healthy subjects will also hold in the patients group, and then we can use this knowledge which we have now with our groundwork also to train and change the experience of these patients. And that's of course the goal of the overall project. I think that's the biggest challenge, to see if we actually can manipulate or change subjective time in a therapeutic context, so that the people's symptoms or patients' symptoms are reduced. So our ultimate goal of the whole project is to really find an alternative means for treating the really negative symptoms patients have. So we know about psychopharmacological treatment, about side effects, also that sometimes these pharmacological treatments actually don't help the patients. We know about problems also with other therapeutic methods, like even with psychotherapy, it's not perfect. So what we want to do is that in the whole, let's say, with the spectrum of potential interventions and treatments, that we have some sort of an additional, very symptom-related means to help patients. And these alternative methods are all, I would say, related to some sort of relaxation flow experiences, all related to subjective time. So, for example, as we know, patients with depression, with anxiety, that they have an overrepresentation of time and self. And through a lot of relaxation methods, we could think even of meditation or certain things like going into the floating tank, where you have a very powerful relaxation method, or, and that's what we're doing, having people getting immersed into virtual reality and virtual worlds, that through a relaxation response, where they lose their sense of self and time, we can help reduce the negative symptoms people or patients, for example, with depression, suffer from. Because, as we said, the main symptoms very often that can be defined, and that was also work from the Cologne group, Kai Vogelei and his co-workers, showing that patients with depression have an overrepresentation of self and time. Then we induce relaxation methods of losing your senses of self and time, and then hopefully that in the context, of course, of a therapeutic bigger therapeutic process, yeah, with psychotherapists, with psychiatrists, then this could be a small part of additionally intervening in these symptoms. Yeah, so we have these two domains we're looking at. We have these two parts: diagnostic and let's say training or intervention. And the diagnostic part, which we also then want to take as a training part into the realm of testing and training patients. What we did was having in various situations, in the real waiting situation and the virtual reality waiting situation, having people wait through empty time. And the task what we had was some sort of mean task, because we had people believe that they were waiting actually for something else to happen in a future time, and they were in a waiting room, either a real waiting room at our institute or a virtual waiting room, because they were waiting for a game to start. And after exactly 7.5 minutes, people came back, or the experimenter came back to the waiting individual subject, and then we asked, how long did you wait? And what we tried to find out was the relationships of the subjective impression of waiting time and other variables. Yeah? And so, of course, what we found was something like the clear and expected relationships, but it was the first time that actually we could empirically show this, that the more bored people were, and the more negative effect in general people felt, the longer subjective duration, the slower passage of time. So, but then additionally, what was important was that we also could relate this to individual traits of the people, that meaning that the more impulsive individuals were and the less self-regulation capacities people had, emotional self-regulation capacities, the worse they felt during waiting, and then the longer subjective duration, the slower passage of time. And why is impulsivity and self-regulation important? These are two aspects which are also dominant in many groups of patients with psychiatric disorders. They have less self-regulation capacities. That could actually be the definition of this disorder, that they have less, they're worse in emotionally self-regulation, regulating themselves, and therefore they have these symptoms of depression, of anxiety, etc. And also impulsivity is one of the main symptoms in many psychiatric disorders. So here we could show, based on some individual traits, emotional reaction happens during waiting, and this leads to then a specific time experience. And then the second part is about the training, you could say, or the intervention, which we did with a video game, a game called Thumper, which is a very dynamic roller coaster-like game where people have to navigate in this roller coaster environment and have to press buttons at the right time to avoid obstacles. And there, what we want to do is induce a flow state, and through this flow state, then, of course, wanted to induce also less experience of time, or having people experience smaller durations, yeah, or a faster passage of time. So that's what we in the second part found out, that again with healthy subjects who played this video game Thumper either on screen or in the virtual reality, that related to flow states, the more flow people experienced, the faster passage of time, and the less they thought about time. So there, at least, again, we could show with healthy participants that through such a dynamic video game, we can induce flow states, and these flow states lead to a subjectively felt faster passage of time. So this is what we then, of course, then later want to induce in some patient groups with depression, that they also feel suddenly flow states and and flow states are positively felt states, and then this also would then effect that they would feel a faster passage of time, which is counteracting the usual states these patients experience, namely that, oh, they're stuck in time, time does not pass, and they're not in flow state. So they're overly representing feeling themselves, yeah? And in flow states, you don't feel yourself, and time passes much more quickly. So through this induction of these states, flow states, faster subjective passage of time, we want to counteract the symptoms of the patient groups. And that's what we at least could show in healthy subjects, that it works.